On the evening of March 18, 1988, around 7:40 p.m., 31-year-old Shinichi Moriya returned to his apartment in Nagoya City. As he neared the entrance, an unsettling feeling crept over him. The front door had been left unlocked, which was very unusual, and the apartment was unusually dark. Shinichi felt uneasy but not yet alarmed. Still, he stepped inside, made his way to the bedroom, and began to change out of his work clothes, unaware of the horrifying discovery that awaited him. As he began to undress, a faint and unexpected sound reached his ears: the cry of a baby. Initially, he brushed it off, thinking it might be his imagination, but the soft wailing continued. Growing concerned, he headed to the living room. What awaited him was beyond anything he could have prepared for. His wife, 27-year-old Mitsuko, who was heavily pregnant, lay motionless on the floor. Her hands had been tightly bound behind her back, and an electrical cord was twisted cruelly around her neck. She was lying on her back in a pool of blood, and it was immediately clear she was no longer breathing. Her body had been viciously slashed from just below her chest to her lower abdomen, a deep wound inflicted by a sharp, thin blade. Her legs were spread wide apart, and between them, a newborn baby lay, barely alive, letting out weak cries amidst the gruesome scene. As disturbing as the sight already was, the discovery inside her abdomen was nothing short of surreal. Instead of the child she had been carrying, he discovered a severed telephone receiver and a set of car keys with a Mickey Mouse keychain stuffed into her body. A grotesque and incomprehensible substitute for the life that should have been there. Shinichi immediately attempted to call emergency services, but realized the phone line in their home had been cut. In desperation, he rushed down the outdoor stairs to a neighbor's apartment, pleading to borrow their phone. The neighbor, who later spoke to reporters, recalled, "Shinichi came to me in a panic, saying, 'The phone line has been ripped out and the baby is out. Please let me use your phone.' I just thought, oh, the baby has been born, and never imagined his wife had been murdered." Paramedics from the Nakagawa Fire Department received the emergency call, believing a baby had just been born. Equipped with forceps and scissors to cut the umbilical cord, they rushed to Shinichi's apartment. However, upon arrival, they were met with a scene far more horrifying and unimaginable than anything they had anticipated. The incident took place in a newly developed residential neighborhood, where farmland and open fields were scattered among the buildings. Despite its semi-rural setting, the area saw little foot traffic at night, creating a quiet and somewhat isolated atmosphere after dark. At the time, 2 families occupied the ground floor units of the apartment building, while the victim and her husband lived on the second floor. Mitsuko's due date was Monday, March 13th, but when the baby hadn't arrived by then, Shinichi began calling home daily during the following week to check on her. On the day of the crime, Friday, March 18th, Shinichi made his usual call around 1:10 p.m. His wife answered, and everything seemed perfectly normal. There were no signs of distress, and nothing out of the ordinary during their conversation. However, this would be the last time he would ever hear her voice again. Around 1:50 p.m., a female acquaintance arrived at their home by car, offering a gift of fresh strawberries. Mitsuko invited her inside, and they enjoyed a chat while sharing the treat. At approximately 3 p.m., Mitsuko accompanied her guest down to the parking lot below the apartment. The acquaintance later recalled that Mitsuko hadn't locked the front door when they left. It's estimated that they were in the parking lot between 3:07 and 3:10 p.m., sparking speculation that the intruder may have entered the apartment during this brief window of time. Between 3:10 and 3:20 p.m., a man described as being in his late 20s or early 30s, with a distinctly round face, visited the apartment below the victims. The resident recalled hearing the door handle rattling before the doorbell rang. When she opened the door, she saw a man around 165 centimeters or 5'5" tall, dressed in a black jumper that resembled a half coat. He asked if she knew a family named Nakamura. Feeling uneasy and not recognizing the name, the woman quickly told him no and shut the door. The man left immediately. There were multiple sightings of a man matching this description. Several residents reported seeing him wandering the area, visiting different apartments and buildings. Despite interviewing over 400 people who were in the vicinity that day, the police were unable to trace the man's identity or whereabouts. At around 4 p.m., a postal worker delivered a postcard to the victim's apartment, leaving it in the mailbox without noticing anything unusual. Mitsuko was known for being meticulous, especially about collecting the mail as soon as it arrived. Yet when her husband came home later that evening, the mail was still untouched in the mailbox. Additionally, Mitsuko had a daily routine of bringing in the laundry by 4:30 p.m., but when her body was discovered, the clothes were still hanging outside. She also had the habit of washing dishes immediately after meals, yet the dishes from the earlier snacks she had shared with her acquaintance remained unwashed on the heated table. These subtle deviations from her usual habits raised more questions about the exact timeline of the crime. At around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, 2 elementary school kids noticed a man near the crime scene. He was about 175 centimeters, or about 5'9" tall, using his coat collar to hide his face. This eerie sighting would later appear even more significant, when just a few hours later, around 7 p.m., another student, returning home from cram school, described seeing the same man wandering for about 10 minutes on the street west of the apartment building. At 6:50 p.m., just before heading home, Shinichi tried calling the house again, but this time there was no answer. The crime scene investigation revealed several important findings. The rope used to bind Mitsuko's hands had been taken from within the apartment, while the knife used to slit her abdomen was missing. Though no fingerprints belonging to the perpetrator were discovered, investigators noted that blood in the kitchen had been partially washed away, indicating the killer's attempt to clean up evidence. Mitsuko's wallet had been taken by the killer before fleeing, yet there were no signs of a struggle within the apartment, and no other valuables appeared to have been stolen, which left investigators puzzled. The telephone receiver, which had been stuffed into her abdomen, was usually kept in the living room, but was found on the kitchen floor with its cord severed. It is believed that the telephone receiver had been removed prior to the investigation, likely by those who discovered Mitsuko's body while preparing to transport her to the hospital. The car keys and Mickey Mouse keychain found inside her abdomen were identified as belonging to Shinichi, who had left them in the apartment since he hadn't used the car that day. The autopsy conducted by Professor Yoshinao Katsumata from Nagoya University revealed that the cause of death was strangulation. However, the marks on her neck suggested that the weapon used for the strangulation was not the electrical cord found wrapped around her neck. It was determined that the cord had been placed there after her death. Further findings from the autopsy showed no evidence of sexual assault, and it was estimated that Mitsuko had died between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. that day. Upon examining the wound on Mitsuko's abdomen, investigators observed the absence of hesitation marks, suggesting that the cuts were made with precise intent. In the early stages of the case, investigators focused their attention on Mitsuko's husband, Shinichi, due to a series of strange behaviors. Upon returning home, Shinichi immediately sensed something was wrong. However, instead of rushing to check on his wife, he changed out of his work clothes into casual attire first. This delay seemed odd, especially given the urgency of the situation. Furthermore, despite the overwhelming stench of blood throughout the apartment, Shinichi didn't immediately notice the strong odor. Their suspicions grew stronger during a media interview when Shinichi, with unsettling calm, said, "My wife loved wine, so I want to offer some to her." He then poured red wine into a glass and placed it at her memorial, a gesture that seemed out of place in the gravity of the situation. His composed demeanor, especially given the horrific nature of the crime, struck investigators as unusually tranquil, only deepening their doubts about his involvement. Shinichi's alibi was eventually verified, with evidence confirming that around 3 p.m., the estimated time of his wife's death, he was still at work, ruling him out as a suspect during that window of time. By 1990, 2 years after the incident, more than 23,500 officers had been involved in the investigation. Authorities tracked over 1,000 suspicious individuals, including known drug users, and interviewed roughly 500 people connected to the victim. Additionally, around 300 local pregnant women were questioned, yet no significant leads emerged, leaving the case shrouded in uncertainty. By 2003, more than 40,000 officers had been mobilized, yet the case remained unsolved. When the statute of limitations finally expired in March that same year, it marked the end of the investigation, leaving the victim's family with no closure and a sense of justice forever out of reach. Professor Toshifumi Ishii, a researcher at Tokyo Medical and Dental University, analyzed the psychological profile of the perpetrator. He suggested that the killer might have harbored a deeply disturbing desire, such as wanting to see the inside of a pregnant woman or personally remove a fetus. The bizarre objects found in the victim's abdomen were likely chosen by the killer to symbolically represent the placenta, umbilical cord, and fetus. The fact that the baby was left alive indicates that the killer had little interest in harming the child. The theory goes further, suggesting the killer strangled the victim first to ensure their experiment would succeed, making sure the woman couldn't fight back. This allowed the perpetrator to carry out the incision without resistance. The clean, deliberate cut in the abdomen indicates that this was the primary objective of the crime, a chilling reflection of the killer's disturbed intentions. Professor Ishii also believes the perpetrator must have been at least 15 years old, as carrying out such a violent act would have required both physical strength and a certain level of knowledge. Furthermore, he suggests that the killer likely possessed a psychopathic personality, displaying a complete lack of empathy for the victim. Despite the chaos and despair at the scene, the couple's newborn had managed to breathe on its own. However, when paramedics arrived, it was evident that the infant had sustained a wound, likely inflicted accidentally by the same knife that had cut through the mother's abdomen. The baby's cries were faint, and it showed signs of hypothermia caused by cold exposure and anemia from the injury. By the time the baby reached the hospital, its body temperature had dropped to around 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, putting its life at risk. Despite the critical condition, the baby's life was saved thanks to the quick discovery, a timely blood transfusion from the baby's grandfather, and the hospital's dedicated medical team. They placed the baby in an incubator to stabilize its body temperature and performed surgery immediately. Although the baby sustained injuries that required 10 days to heal, the 1-hour surgery was successful, and the baby miraculously survived. This chilling blend of calculated violence and chaos is a pattern that can also be seen in the crimes of Akihiro Goto. Originally from Nagoya City, Goto became infamous for a series of brutal murders beginning in July 2006. His crimes were marked by both methodical planning and disordered execution, a combination that solidified his reputation as a figure of fear and horror in Japan's criminal history. His victim, a 24-year-old Vietnamese woman named Lee Thi Ri, was found murdered in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. Her body was discovered with multiple wounds, the most shocking being a deep, gruesome incision across her abdomen. But Goto was not finished. In 2011, he once again unleashed his brutality. This time, his victim was Mayumi Nagase, a colleague from his part-time job. Goto violently assaulted and killed Nagase, but this time, he made a fatal mistake. His DNA was discovered on Nagase's body, leading authorities to arrest him. Goto's cell phone contained photographs of Lee Thi Ri's lifeless body, a horrifying piece of evidence that solidified his connection to her murder. Goto's violent actions, particularly his apparent fascination with abdominal mutilation, bear striking similarities to the acts of the unknown perpetrator in the case involving the pregnant woman. Geographically, Goto's crimes also provoke unsettling questions. Both of his known murders took place in and around Nagoya, suggesting a disturbing possibility that he may have been influenced by or even connected to the case of the pregnant woman. Authorities followed countless leads, questioned numerous individuals, and re-examined the evidence multiple times, yet no conclusive answers have ever emerged. With each passing year, the chances of uncovering the truth continue to fade, leaving both investigators and her loved ones without closure. The case has left a permanent mark on the community, but even after all this time, it remains unsolved to this day.